The date is April 12th, 1945. American forces of the Ninth Army have just established a bridgehead across the Elbe River, less than 70 miles from the shattered streets of Berlin. To the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army is tearing through the collapsing German lines like a buzzsaw through rotten timber, fueled by high-octane gasoline and an insatiable thirst for momentum. Yet, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, issues the halt order. He draws an invisible line on the map, effectively handing the prize of the German capital to Joseph Stalin and the approaching Red Army. But what if that order was ignored, delayed, or simply never given? What if Patton, a man who famously despised the Soviets and viewed them as the next great threat to Western civilization, was unleashed to drive his armor straight into the heart of the Third Reich, before the hammer and sickle could be raised over the Reichstag? Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactical realities, the logistical nightmares, and the alternate timelines of military history. If you want to support deep-dive strategic analysis that doesn't pull punches, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and sound off in the comments with your own thoughts on how this scenario would play out. To understand the sheer gravity of an American drive on Berlin, we have to strip away the romanticized Hollywood version of World War II and look at the cold, hard geopolitics that had been brewing for decades. The alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union was never a brotherhood of shared values. It was a marriage of convenience, forged in the fires of 1941, driven by the mutual necessity of destroying Adolf Hitler. The roots of this distrust go all the way back to 1917, during the Bolshevik Revolution, when American expeditionary forces were actually sent to Russia to intervene against the Red Army. Fast forward to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and the cracks in the alliance were already becoming tectonic fault lines. Franklin D. Roosevelt, visibly dying and desperate, to secure Soviet entry into the Pacific War against Japan, made massive concessions to Stalin. Winston Churchill, a staunch anti-communist who vividly remembered the geopolitical chess matches of the 19th century, was practically having a stroke, watching Eastern Europe being handed over to Soviet domination. Churchill even ordered his general staff to draft Operation Unthinkable, a highly classified contingency plan to attack the Soviet Union immediately after the defeat of Germany. But Eisenhower, sitting at the apex of the Allied expeditionary force, was looking at the map not as a politician, but as a military manager obsessed with logistics and casualty mitigation. To Ike, Berlin was a geographic objective that had lost its strategic military value. The German government was scattering, the industrial base was a smoking crater, and taking the city would require fighting, block by block, against suicidal Hitler Youth and desperate SS units. Eisenhower estimated it would cost 100,000 American casualties to take Berlin, a price he was completely unwilling to pay for a city that had already been promised to the Soviet occupation zone by the politicians at Yalta. Why would a rational commander throw away the lives of tens of thousands of American boys for a pile of rubble that he would just have to hand over to the Russians a week later? From a purely managerial standpoint, Eisenhower's logic was bulletproof. But war is rarely fought on pure logic, and General George S. Patton was anything but a conventional manager. Patton viewed the war through the lens of classical antiquity, seeing himself in the lineage of Caesar and Alexander, where capturing the enemy's capital was the ultimate psychological decapitation of the opposing empire. More importantly, Patton had a terrifyingly accurate geopolitical foresight regarding the Soviet Union. He openly stated that the United States had fought the wrong enemy and that the Anglo-American armies should not stop at the Elbe, but rearm the surrendered German Wehrmacht and push the Soviets back to the Volga. To understand what would happen if Patton's Third Army, alongside Simpson's Ninth Army, were given the green light to take Berlin, we must conduct a brutal, microscopic comparison of the forces in play during the spring of 1945. Let us start with the American war machine, an entity that had evolved from a peacetime skeleton crew in 1939 into the most highly mechanized, logistically dominant force in human history. Patton's Third Army at this stage was a juggernaut, fielding over 500,000 men, organized into multiple corps, with armored divisions that were rewriting the doctrine of mobile warfare. The spearhead of this force was the U.S. Armored Division, a uniquely American organizational structure that emphasized extreme flexibility and decentralized command. Unlike the heavy, cumbersome tank armies of the Soviets, an American armored division was broken down into combat commands, designated A, B, and Reserve. These were essentially highly mobile, self-contained combined arms task forces, seamlessly integrating medium tanks, armored infantry in M3 half-tracks, and self-propelled artillery like the M7 Priest. The backbone of this armored thrust was the M4 Sherman tank, specifically the later variants like the M4A3E8, affectionately known as the Easy 8. Forget the post-war myths about the Sherman being a death trap, because by 1945 it was arguably the most reliable, operationally strategic tank on the battlefield. Powered by a 500 horsepower Ford GAA V8 engine, the Easy 8 featured the new horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS, and wider tracks, giving it excellent cross-country mobility even in the notorious spring mud of Central Europe. It was armed with the high-velocity 76mm M1 gun, capable of firing high-velocity armor-piercing, or HVAP, tungsten rounds that could punch through the frontal armor of a German Panther tank at standard combat ranges. But the true lethality of the American armored column was not just the tank itself. It was the symphony of destruction it could call upon. Every American tank platoon had radios, allowing for real-time coordination that the Soviets could only dream of. When an American spearhead ran into a fortified German position, they didn't just throw bodies at it in human wave attacks. They used their radios to call in time-on-target artillery barrages, where multiple batteries of 155mm long-tom howitzers synchronized their firing so that all shells impacted the target at the exact same millisecond. And if artillery wasn't enough, they had the ultimate trump card in the sky: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a flying tank, weighing in at up to 17,000 pounds, fully loaded, armed with 850 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs or high-velocity aerial rockets. The integration of forward air controllers riding in tanks on the ground, talking directly to the fighter bombers overhead, meant that Patton's spearheads had an umbrella of flying artillery clearing the path ahead of them. However, this mechanized beast had a critical vulnerability, and that was its insatiable appetite for logistics. How do you feed an army that consumes hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel a day while advancing 30 to 40 miles in a single bound? The American logistical tale was a marvel of industrial engineering, relying on the Red Ball Express concept, pipelines laid under the English Channel, and thousands of 2.5-ton trucks moving in continuous convoys. But the further east Patton pushed, the thinner that logistical tether became. Supply lines stretching all the way back to the ports of Antwerp and Cherbourg would be strained to the absolute breaking point, echoing the logistical nightmares faced by Confederate General Robert E. Lee when he stretched his supply lines during the Gettysburg Campaign, or the risky operational pause required during the race to Messina in 1943. Now, let us shift our gaze to the east, to the looming shadow of the Soviet Red Army, specifically Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front. If the American army was a rapier wielded by a skilled fencer, the Red Army of 1945 was a massive, blood-soaked sledgehammer that crushed everything in its path through sheer, unadulterated mass and ruthless attrition. The Soviet forces arrayed against Berlin numbered over 2.5 million men, backed by over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and supported by a staggering 41,000 artillery pieces. The Soviet doctrine of deep battle relied on achieving overwhelming localized superiority. Blasting a hole in the enemy lines with an artillery bombardment of apocalyptic proportions, and then pouring tank armies into the operational depth to encircle and annihilate the enemy. The tip of the Soviet spear was the T-34-85 medium tank and the monstrous IS-2 heavy tank. The T-34-85, with its sloped armor, Christie suspension, and reliable V2 diesel engine, was perfectly suited for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. It was crude, lacking the ergonomic refinements and advanced optics of the Sherman, but it was produced in numbers that defied comprehension, designed for a war where the average lifespan of a tank on the battlefield was measured in weeks, not years. The IS-2, weighing 46 tons and armed with a massive 122mm main gun, was a bunker buster designed to shatter German heavy armor and fortifications. While its rate of fire was agonizingly slow due to the two-piece ammunition, a single high-explosive shell from an IS-2 could literally rip the turret off a German Panzer IV or level a city block. The Soviet artillery arm was the true god of war in their doctrine, utilizing everything from 76mm field guns to the terrifying BM-13 Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, known as Stalin's organs, which could saturate a grid square with high explosives in a matter of seconds. But the Red Army had its own glaring weaknesses. Their logistics were heavily reliant on American Lend-Lease equipment, specifically the Studebaker US-6 trucks, without which their deep penetration operations would have ground to a halt. Furthermore, the Soviet command structure was rigidly top-down, driven by fear of the NKVD political commissars. Initiative at the junior officer level was virtually non-existent, meaning that if a Soviet plan went off the rails, it took significant time and blood to adapt to the new reality. And then there is the human element. The psychological state of the Red Army soldier in 1945. These men had fought their way back from the gates of Moscow, witnessing the systematic extermination of their people by the SS and the Wehrmacht. They were not coming to Berlin to liberate. They were coming to exact a biblical vengeance, driven by state-sponsored propaganda that encouraged the plundering, burning, and brutalizing of the German civilian population. Caught between these two colossal war machines was the remnants of the German Wehrmacht, specifically Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, a master of defensive warfare. Heinrici knew he could not stop the Soviets. His only goal was to bleed them for every inch of ground and hold the line long enough for as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to flee west and surrender to the Americans. The German forces were a hollow shell of the Blitzkrieg armies of 1940, consisting of depleted panzer divisions with a handful of formidable Tiger IIs and Panthers that had no fuel to move, supplemented by the Volkssturm, a desperate militia of old men and young boys armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. If Patton and Simpson were unleashed to race for Berlin, they would be driving straight into this chaotic, apocalyptic meat grinder. The terrain between the Elbe River and Berlin is relatively flat, characterized by forests, small villages, and a network of lakes and rivers, ideal tank country, but also dotted with natural choke points. The weather in April 1945 was a mix of spring rain and lingering mud, factors that would test the off-road capabilities of the American HVSS suspensions and the Soviet Dwight track alike. The strategic implications of an American drive on Berlin are staggering to contemplate. It would require a fundamental shift in Eisenhower's broad front strategy, concentrating all available fuel, bridging equipment, and air support to the Third and Ninth Armies. It would mean starving other Allied sectors of supplies, a political nightmare for Eisenhower, who had to balance the egos of commanders like British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. But if the logistical pipeline was secured and Patton was given the green light, the American mechanized cavalry would begin a high-speed dash across the German plains, bypassing strong points and leaving them for the infantry to mop up. They would be racing against time, against the muddy terrain, and against the millions of vengeful Soviet troops crashing through the Silo Heights just east of the city. The stage is set for a collision of industrial titans, a scenario where the advanced combined arms fluidity of the military would theoretically clash with the blunt, overwhelming mass of the Soviet war machine in the rubble-strewn streets of the Third Reich's capital. As the American tank tracks chew through the mud of the German countryside, heading relentlessly eastward, the question is no longer whether they can reach the city limits, but what exactly happens when they kick down the door and find the Red Army waiting on the other side. The crossing of the Elbe River by the United States Ninth Army is a masterpiece of combat engineering that rarely gets the respect it deserves. Under the cover of darkness, bridging units of the Army Corps of Engineers wrestle heavy steel pontoons into the freezing, fast-flowing water. They are constructing Bailey Bridges, a modular, prefabricated marvel of British and American design that can support the 40-ton weight of an advancing armoured column. By the morning of April 13th, 1945, the steel treads of the 2nd Armoured Division, known as Hell on Wheels, are clanking across these metal spans, leaving the Western Bank behind. To the south, Patton's Third Army has already established its own bridgeheads. His troops, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of adrenaline, combat fatigue, and the sheer intoxicating momentum of victory. Patton is treating this drive exactly like his famous race to Messina in Sicily in 1943, where he drove his men to the point of exhaustion just to beat British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to the prize. But this time, the rival is not a pompous British ally. It is the ruthless, unstoppable machine of the Soviet Red Army. To execute this 70-mile sprint to Berlin, the American tactical doctrine has to shift from broad front maneuvering to a highly concentrated, narrow spearhead. The tip of this spear is heavily reliant on a weapon system that has only just arrived in the European theatre, the M26 Pershing heavy tank. For years, American armoured crews had been forced to rely on numbers and flanking manoeuvres to defeat the superior armour of German Panthers and Tigers. But the Pershing, deployed in limited numbers during the Zebra mission to field test, the vehicle in combat, changes the mathematical equation of armoured warfare. Weighing in at 41.5 tons, the M26 is a radical departure from the tall, narrow profile of the Sherman tank. It sits low to the ground, utilizing a torsion bar suspension system that provides an incredibly stable platform, even when moving over the shattered, cratered roads of eastern Germany. Its frontal armour is over 4 inches thick, heavily sloped to deflect incoming kinetic penetrators. But the true equalizer is mounted in the turret, the 90mm M3 rifled gun. This weapon is capable of firing a 24-pound armour-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. It is a gun that can punch straight through the frontal glacis of a Panther tank at 1,000 yards. And more importantly for this scenario, It is one of the few American weapons capable of reliably cracking the cast steel turret of a Soviet IS-2 heavy tank. How do you prepare a mechanized force designed for open-field maneuver warfare to fight in the claustrophobic, rubble-choked streets of a dying metropolis? The answer lies in the harsh lessons the American Army learned during the Battle of Aachen in October 1944. Aachen was the first major German city to fall to the Allies, and it taught American infantry that fighting door-to-door is a meat grinder that consumes battalions in a matter of days. To survive the urban sprawl of Berlin, the advancing American infantry divisions, like the battle-hardened 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, rely on the tactic of mouse-holing. Instead of walking through doors or windows, which are inevitably booby-trapped or covered by enemy machine guns, American combat engineers use satchel charges of C4 explosive and M9 bazookas to blow holes directly through the interior walls of adjoining row houses. The infantry clears a building from the top floor down, throwing fragmentation grenades through the newly blasted holes, followed immediately by bursts of fire from the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, or Bayard. The American infantryman's primary weapon, the M1 Garand, gives him a distinct advantage in these mid-range urban engagements. As a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle firing the powerful .30 caliber round, the Garand allows an American soldier to put 8 aimed, lethal shots down a hallway in a matter of seconds, far outpacing the bolt-action Mausers of the German defenders or the Mosin Nagants of the Soviet infantry. However, in extreme close-quarters combat, inside a dust-choked basement or a ruined subway tunnel, the American soldier is at a disadvantage against the Soviet PPH-41 submachine gun. The Soviet weapon fires a smaller 7.6 2mm pistol cartridge, but it feeds from a massive 71-round drum magazine, acting essentially as a handheld buzzsaw that can clear a room through sheer volume of lead. As the American spearheads break out from the Elbe on April 14th, the weather is a miserable 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a thick, low-hanging overcast. This cloud cover grounds the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, stripping the American columns of their vital close air support. They are driving blind into the German heartland, relying entirely on the organic firepower of their armoured cavalry reconnaissance squadrons. These squadrons, mounted in M8 Greyhound armoured cars and heavily armed jeeps, screen miles ahead of the main tank columns, probing for ambushes and weak points in the crumbling German lines. What they find is not a cohesive defence, but a surreal landscape of total military collapse. They encounter elements of the German 12th Army, commanded by General Walther Wenck. Historically, Wenck turned his army around and fought his way west specifically to surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet captivity. In this alternate timeline, with Patton and Simpson charging east, Wenck does not even have to move. The American vanguards simply roll through the German positions. German commanders eagerly hand over their maps, pointing out the cleared roads through the minefields and providing the Americans with desperately needed intelligence, on the exact locations of the Soviet vanguards. This creates a bizarre, unprecedented logistical and tactical anomaly. American tanks are refueling at captured German depots, using captured German fuel, while disarmed German soldiers stand on the side of the road, cheering the American columns onward. It is a scene reminiscent of the chaotic meeting engagements of the American Civil War, like the Battle of Gettysburg, where two massive armies blindly grope toward each other over unfamiliar terrain, completely altering the strategic landscape in a matter of hours. By April 16th, the logistical strain on the American supply lines is reaching a critical mass. The Red Ball Express, the legendary convoy system of 2.5-ton trucks, is stretched over 400 miles from the western ports. Truck drivers are popping amphetamines, driving for 48 hours straight, falling asleep at the wheel and crashing into ditches just to keep the artillery shells and aviation gas flowing to the front. Patton ruthlessly cannibalizes the supply allocations of other American armies, hoarding gasoline and ammunition, fully aware that if his tanks run dry in the suburbs of Berlin, they will become sitting ducks for Soviet heavy artillery. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the east of Berlin, the earth is literally shaking. Marshal Georgy Zhukov has unleashed the most concentrated artillery bombardment in the history of human warfare upon the Silo Heights. Over 1 million artillery shells are fired in a matter of hours, turning the night sky into a terrifying, continuous sheet of artificial daylight. The Soviet doctrine of urban warfare is fundamentally different from the American approach. Where the Americans use precision firepower and infantry infiltration to clear a city block by block, the Soviets use blunt, apocalyptic force. Having learned their brutal trade in the ruins of Stalingrad, the Red Army does not bypass strongpoints. They obliterate them. They bring massive 203mm B4 tracked howitzers, nicknamed Stalin's sledgehammers, directly into the city streets, using them in a direct fire roll to level entire apartment complexes with a single 220-pound high explosive shell. When Stalin receives intelligence from his spies in London and Washington that American armored columns have crossed the Elbe and are moving at breakneck speed toward Berlin, his paranoia reaches a boiling point. He believes the Western Allies have signed a secret, separate peace treaty with the Nazis. He immediately contacts Zhukov and Konev, demanding they take the city regardless of the cost in human lives. The Soviet advance, already a bloodbath, turns into a frantic, suicidal rush. Soviet tanks are ordered to drive their T-34s directly into German anti-tank kill zones just to exhaust the enemy's ammunition. By April 18th, the two greatest military machines on the planet are converging on the same devastated metropolitan area. The American 2nd Armored Division hits the western outskirts of Berlin, reaching the Havel River and the suburb of Spandau. The bridges have been blown by frantic SS demolition teams, forcing the American engineers to once again brave enemy sniper fire to throw pontoon bridges across the water. The air is thick with the smell of cordite, burning brick and raw sewage. American tank commanders ride with their heads out of the hatches, their eyes scanning the ruined rooftops for the dreaded silhouette of a Panzerfaust, while their radios crackle with frantic, overlapping reports from the reconnaissance screens. At the exact same time, Zhukov's first Belorussian front is smashing through the eastern suburbs of Lichtenberg and Friedrichshain. The battlefield geometry is shrinking by the minute. There are no clear front lines, no established boundaries, and no communication between the Allied commands. The supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in France is in a state of absolute panic, frantically transmitting blind radio messages, in the clear, begging Patton to halt his advance. Patton, sitting in his command, half-track, supposedly suffers a convenient radio failure, ignoring the orders and pushing his men deeper into the urban labyrinth. What happens when a Soviet tank battalion, exhausted, blood-drunk, and expecting to find only retreating Germans, rounds a corner in the Tiergarten and comes face to face with a column of American Pershing tanks? The Soviet commanders do not speak English. They do not have the tactical radios to call their higher headquarters for clarification, and they have been told by their political commissars that the capitalists are conspiring with the fascists. The American gunners, staring through their telescopic sights, see the distinctive sloped armor and the red star painted on the turrets of tanks they have been trained to identify as friendly, but which are currently traversing their massive main guns directly toward the American positions. In the dust and smoke of a ruined city, where adrenaline overrides training and survival instinct trumps geopolitics, the margin for error is exactly zero. Fingers tighten on the triggers of 90mm cannons and heavy machine guns, as the fate of post-war Europe balances on the edge of a single, catastrophic misunderstanding. The tension in the ruined intersection of the Tiergarten is finally broken not by a high-level diplomatic cable, but by the frayed nerves of an exhausted American gunner. Sitting in the cramped turret of an M4A3E8 Sherman, running on zero sleep and chemical stimulants, he watches the massive 122mm main gun of a Soviet IS-2 heavy tank slowly traverse toward his platoon commander's vehicle. He steps heavily on the firing pedal. The 76mm high-velocity, armor-piercing tracer round streaks across the dust-choked boulevard, sparking violently off the thick cast steel turret of the Soviet behemoth. The Cold War goes hot in a frantic, accidental exchange of high explosives, born from the absolute chaos of an urban meeting engagement. Instantly, Soviet infantry riding on the engine decks of T-34s dismount and open fire with their PP-41 submachine guns, sweeping the street with a relentless hail of pistol-caliber bullets. American armored infantry, taking cover behind the steel plating of their M3 half-tracks, return fire with 50-caliber Browning heavy machine guns, turning the brick facades of the surrounding German architecture into a deadly shower of shrapnel. The claustrophobic streets fill with the blinding white smoke of phosphorus grenades, as both sides blindly pour fire into the shadows, completely unaware of the strategic catastrophe they are initiating. It takes hours of frantic, overlapping radio calls, relayed through command half-tracks and forward observation posts, to finally reach General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims and Marshal Zhukov's forward command post. The supreme commanders are forced to intervene directly, screaming over tactical networks to initiate an immediate, localized ceasefire before the skirmish escalates into a theater-wide conflagration. This terrifying firefight exposes the catastrophic danger of allowing a theater commander's aggressive ego to override grand strategy, a lesson the United States military would have to learn again just 5 years later. We saw this exact same perilous dynamic play out during the Korean War, when General Douglas MacArthur ignored the geopolitical realities of the Yalu River, pushed his forces too far north against direct orders, and triggered a massive, devastating intervention by the Chinese Communist military. In both scenarios, a brilliant but insubordinate general believed that tactical momentum and firepower could solve a complex political crisis, completely underestimating the enemy's willingness to escalate and the fragile nature of international alliances. From a purely logistical perspective, Patton's rogue army has reached its culminating point, a concept famously coined by the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, describing the exact moment when an attacking force loses its momentum and becomes vulnerable to a devastating counterattack. The American logistical tether is now completely severed. The 2.5-ton trucks of the legendary Red Ball Express are stranded hundreds of miles to the west, their gas tanks bone dry, unable to bridge the gap between the Rhine and the Elbe. To sustain the Third and Ninth Armies in the heart of Berlin, the United States Army Air Forces would have to initiate a massive, desperate aerial resupply operation. Squadrons of C-47 Skytrains and C-46 Commandos would be forced to drop fuel, ammunition and plasma into a heavily contested urban airspace. This would essentially be a chaotic, improvised precursor to the Berlin airlift of 1948, but conducted under the constant, terrifying threat of Soviet anti-aircraft batteries and roaming squadrons of Yakovlev Yak-3 fighter planes that might misidentify the American transports as hostile. In Washington, the situation is a political nightmare of unprecedented, world-ending proportions. Harry S. Truman has been the President of the United States for less than a week, following the sudden, shocking death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12th. Truman is completely in the dark regarding the secret handshake agreements made with Stalin at the Yalta Conference, and he has not even been fully briefed on the existence of the Manhattan Project. Suddenly, this inexperienced commander-in-chief is handed a crisis that threatens to ignite World War III before World War II has even officially concluded. The intelligence apparatus has utterly failed him. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA under the command of Wild Bill Donovan, has failed to establish a clear, reliable back-channel communication with the Soviet NKVD to prevent this exact type of fratricidal collision on the ground. This diplomatic tightrope walk is remarkably similar to the Trent Affair of 1861, during the opening months of the American Civil War. In that historical crisis, an overzealous American naval captain illegally boarded a British mail ship to arrest 2 Confederate diplomats, sparking absolute outrage in London and bringing the Union to the absolute brink of a 2-front war against both the Confederacy and the British Empire. President Abraham Lincoln had the strategic wisdom and the political courage to swallow his pride, release the diplomats, and de-escalate the situation, famously adhering to the philosophy of fighting one war at a time. Truman and Eisenhower are forced to adopt this exact same Lincoln-esque pragmatism, looking at the global chessboard rather than just the tactical map of Berlin. The American public is suffering from severe, deep-rooted war weariness, having endured 4 years of rationing, casualty telegrams, and global sacrifice. Furthermore, the Pacific War is raging at this exact moment, with the United States Navy and Marine Corps taking horrific, unprecedented casualties in the bloody meat grinder of Okinawa. The American industrial base, while operating at peak efficiency, is geared toward finishing off the Japanese Empire, not retooling for a massive, protracted land war against the Soviet Union in the irradiated ruins of Eastern Europe. The United States does hold a massive economic trump card in the form of the Lend-Lease program. If the skirmish in Berlin escalates into a full-blown war, Truman could immediately sever the supply of Studebaker trucks, aviation fuel, and canned food that is literally keeping the Red Army moving and feeding its soldiers. However, economic leverage takes months to actually impact the tactical reality on the battlefield, and the American troops trapped in the narrow streets of Berlin would be facing encirclement and annihilation by Soviet heavy artillery in a matter of days. Eisenhower, furious at Patton's blatant insubordination and the existential risk he has placed the entire Allied war effort in, threatens to relieve him of command on the spot and completely cut off his fuel and ammunition allocations if he does not immediately pull his forces back to the pre-agreed occupation zones. Patton, despite his grand standing, his theatrical pearl-handled revolvers, and his genuine, prophetic belief that the Soviets are the true long-term enemy of the free world, is a military man who ultimately understands the unbreakable chain of command. With bitter resentment and profound anger, he orders the American armored columns to throw their transmissions into reverse. The retreat from Berlin is a humiliating, agonizing process for the American GI. The soldiers of the 2nd Armored and the 104th Infantry, who had fought, bled, and watched their friends die to capture the western suburbs of the German capital, are forced to watch as the Red Army rolls in right behind them. They watch as the hammer and sickle is raised over the Reichstag, and they listen to the distant echoes as the surviving German civilian population is subjected to a horrific, state-sponsored campaign of retribution and brutality by the advancing Soviet forces. The psychological toll on the American soldier is immense. Realizing that their high-speed, heroic dash across Germany was a politically useless gesture that cost American lives for ground they were simply ordered to abandon. If Patton had reached Berlin before the Soviets, it would not have resulted in a glorious, triumphant end to the Second World War, as he had envisioned. It would have been a logistical catastrophe, a political disaster, and a tactical nightmare that nearly triggered a catastrophic, apocalyptic conflict between the two emerging superpowers of the 20th century. It proves that in the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, the speed of your tanks, the bravery of your infantry, and the firepower of your artillery are entirely irrelevant if they are not tethered to a coherent, unified, and realistic political strategy. The greatest tragedies in military history do not always occur when an army is defeated on the battlefield, but when a victorious army outruns the political realities of the world it is trying to conquer. If you were sitting in the Oval Office in April 1945, how would you have handled General Patton's rogue advance into Berlin? Option A. Relieve Patton of command immediately. Order a full withdrawal. And apologize to Stalin to avoid sparking World War III. Option B. Support Patton's advance, hold the ground, and threaten to use the atomic bomb when ready to force the Soviets out of Eastern Europe entirely. Or option C, order a tactical withdrawal to save American lives, but use the temporary presence of American troops in Berlin to aggressively renegotiate the Yalta agreements and secure a better post-war map. Drop your answer and your strategic reasoning in the comments below.